This is a review on the Canon RF 100-400 f5.6 to f8 telephoto zoom lens. This lens was released in October of 2021, retails for $649.99 or $650 US. And spoiler alert here for the end of the review, this is possibly the best budget wildlife lens on the market right now. Now, last weekend, I went out and rented this lens for about 4 days. Was able to test it out on wildlife out in the field, and basically got some sample photos and took notes on what I liked and what I didn't like about the lens. And I'm going to be using the photos that I gathered as well as the notes to basically review this lens specifically for wildlife photography. This isn't going to be focused on how you might use this lens for landscapes or portraits or anything like that. This is going to be specifically from the point of view of a wildlife photographer using this lens for wildlife photography. And I'm going to format this review very similar to the review video that I did on the Canon EF 100-400 Mark II lens. In that review that I did earlier this year, I kind of broke the review down into sections, and in each section I talked about a different aspect of the lens, and that's going to be kind of how I do this one as well. So jumping straight into it, let's not waste any time. Let's first talk about the size and weight of this lens. Given that this is a 100-400 millimeter lens, this thing is insanely small and weighs basically nothing. I mean, you can see here compared to the 100-400 EF lens, and definitely a noticeable size difference. Now obviously there's different apertures and different things about these lenses that make the EF larger, but overall, definitely much smaller, much easier to use, much easier to handhold, and only weighs 1.4 pounds as opposed to, you know, this EF lens, which is really the next step up for what you would go in terms of wildlife lenses, weighs almost 4 pounds. So huge difference there. And the RF 100-400 is light, small, easy to handhold, and like I said, has a great zoom range given how light and small and easy to handhold it is. So I can't complain at all in terms of size and weight. This thing is awesome, and definitely really great for that. Great zoom lens that, you know, if you're going into the backcountry and you're doing a lot of hiking and, you know, you're not looking to carry in your big prime lenses and bigger zoom lenses, this is an awesome option for that because you can't beat the size and the weight on it given the range that you're getting here. So size and weight is a huge plus on this. Because it is so small, it does have a very large throw between 100 and 400 millimeters. You have to turn your hand a lot of times to actually, you know, zoom it out from 100 to 400, but that is just kind of a downside of it being the size that it is. Honestly, not that big of a deal. You just have to turn a little extra compared to other lenses. Most people probably wouldn't even notice that. It's just something that I noticed upon reviewing it and comparing it to the 100-400 EF Mark II lens. So moving on to the next section, now I want to talk about sharpness on this lens. To be honest, I was very impressed by how sharp this lens was. I won't say that it holds up to your best of the best prime lenses, but I would say that it holds up even to the, you know, intermediate level lenses like the EF 100-400 Mark II or the RF 100-500. It really does hold in range with some of those other, you know, great telephoto zoom lenses that are a lot more expensive than it. And to showcase this, I did take some sample photos at a couple of different apertures. I started at f8 at 400 millimeters because obviously, you know, f8 is your minimum aperture that you can get at 400 millimeters. So we're going to start there, and then we're going to move our way up into like f10 and see how much it changes, because oftentimes when you do stop down a little bit from whatever your minimum aperture is, you're going to begin to see a little bit more sharpness. And I do think we see that a little bit in these photos, not a ton. So taking a look at these sample photos, I have a photo here of an elk, and I'm just going to increase the exposure a little bit there just to make it easier to see. But besides that, this is the raw file. I've done no sharpening, you know, nothing to this. This is taken on the Canon EOS R5, and you can see here when I zoom in to 300%, pretty darn sharp results. I mean, I won't say that it is, you know, as sharp as you can possibly get, but pretty sharp. And, you know, the noise also has a factor to play in that. When you're zoomed in, you know, this far at, even at ISO 1250 on an R5, zoomed in at 300, you're going to see a little bit of noise. And we're seeing that here, but honestly, pretty darn sharp, especially if you look at that number in the ear. That's a great indicator. Really sharp. Not much to complain about here by any means. Definitely very impressive at f8. And given, like I said, the price on this lens, $650, tack sharp lens that holds up with a lot of the other Canon zoom lenses. Now moving on to another image here, you can see this one, just increase the exposure a bit. This one was shot at f9, and when I zoom in here, you can see generally pretty close in sharpness, but maybe a little bit more on these fine hairs, maybe just a little bit sharper on some of these finer details. And when you look at the number, definitely I noticed an increase in sharpness there. Not much, it's a very minor increase. F8 is pretty darn sharp, but I definitely do think that it is a little bit sharper when you do stop down, and you really, again, have to be pixel peeping to find this. I mean, like I said, you can see here I'm at 300%, and you can see just how zoomed in we are on this file right here. We're very zoomed in, and you really have to be pixel peeping to be able to notice these differences. But the differences are there. It is a little sharper. And then if we go on even to another file here and look at a photo taken at f10, you can see again that we're seeing an increase in sharpness. Not much, but there is an increase. I definitely think that this is a little bit sharper than even the f9 one was, and especially more than the photos at f8. I mean, you can really just see the fine details and the fine hairs a little bit more clearly, and it's really just a matter of your preference when it comes to sharpness on this thing. I think that you're going to be able to shoot at your minimum aperture of f8 at 400 millimeters and get sharp results and get results that you're going to be happy with. But for a lot of people, I know they want the sharpest of the sharp. And for that, you are going to have to stop down a little bit, which is typical of zoom lenses. That isn't exclusive to this lens, but it's something to note before you purchase it, because if you are going to want that maximum sharpness possible, you are going to have to stop down to something like f10, which is not in any way an ideal aperture for wildlife photography. And I'm not going to get into aperture yet. That's going to be a whole section we're going to talk about a little bit later in the review. But overall, on sharpness, I'm very pleased with this lens, very impressed with it. Again, for the price point, this thing holds up to some of your best Canon zoom lenses out there that cost triple the price of what this costs. And I think for most people, you're going to be totally satisfied with the sharpness that you're getting out of this lens, even at f8. Next, I want to talk a little bit about focusing speed with this lens. I shot this lens on the Canon EOS R5, which is known to be one of the fastest focusing cameras on the market right now. And I noticed no limitations to my camera when using this lens. I noticed that it focused just as fast with this lens as with any other lens that I've used. I mean, it did not limit the R5 at all. The focus speed was lightning fast, and it was able to lock onto subjects basically immediately, within milliseconds. It was able to lock onto subjects. I was, again, very much like sharpness, very impressed by the focusing speed of this lens and the focusing accuracy of this lens, given that it is, a $650 lens. I was very, very surprised and blown away by it, and didn't notice any limitation to the speed of the camera and its ability to focus at all by using this lens. Honestly, not much to say here because there's really nothing to complain about with it. It was just as fast as, my EF 100 to 400 up there that is 3 times the price. It was very, very spectacular. So I would say in terms of both sharpness and focusing speed, you're going to get great results out of this that you're going to be very pleased with. And obviously that is very important for wildlife photography because you're going to want to be able to lock focus quickly. You have a scene playing out, you have an animal moving through a scene, and you have to achieve focus as quickly as possible and start firing off those shots. And you're going to be able to do that with this lens. You're not going to have to worry about, the lens searching for, 5 to 10 seconds before it gets focused on the animal. It's going to lock very quickly. Now granted, I was shooting again on the Canon EOS R5, which is known to have one of the best autofocus systems and fastest autofocus systems on the market. So shooting this lens on a different camera, you may not get as fast of results. But when you put this lens on a camera that isn't limiting the lens, you're going to get lightning fast results out of it, that's for sure. So in the end, I was very impressed by the focusing speed on this lens, and there's really not much else to say about it. So moving on to the next thing, let's talk about some of the settings that you have on this lens, some of the different switches that you have that allow you to control it and set it up however you want to fit your needs in the field while you're shooting. So the first little switch that you have on this lens is the lock switch, and basically what this does is it locks the zooming feature of the lens in place. So if you zoom it all the way into 100 millimeters, you can switch that lock, and now when you try to turn the lens and you try to twist it and zoom out, it's not going to be able to move at all because it's locked. You can't turn it at all, and this could be helpful if maybe you're carrying the lens and you don't want it to creep down and slowly start to zoom out as it's being pulled down by gravity. You can put the lock on, so it's helpful for that, and then you just switch it back to unlocked to be able to zoom it out again. Pretty simple little switch on there. Now getting to the other switches, these have a little bit bigger of an effect on how you're using the lens, and the first one is going to be the autofocus versus manual focus switch here. Basically pretty self-explanatory. If you have it on AF, then you're using autofocus. If you switch it over to MF, then that's going to be using manual focus. Pretty simple. You basically are just turning off autofocus on the lens when you switch it to manual focus. And then the last switch here is going to be the stabilization switch. And basically you can turn the stabilizer on the lens on and off with this switch. And speaking of stabilization, I do want to talk a little bit about the stabilization in this lens because it is also very impressive given the price. So it has 5.5 stops of image stabilization, and when you pair that with, again, I was shooting on the Canon R5, which has in-body stabilization, you see some spectacular stabilization results. Even on other cameras without in-body stabilization, 5.5 stops of stabilization is going to be very helpful. And to display just how strong this stabilization is in this lens, I actually filmed a few clips in the field of me basically just panning the lens upward. These were shot at 400 millimeters and was, trying to hold them as steadily as I could. And you can see I have one clip here with the stabilizer off, and you can see how shaky that video footage is there. And then when I switch over to this clip with the stabilizer on, you can see just how much that improved and how much the image stabilization in this lens really does help when you're out there in the field and shooting. It really is a lot more helpful than I think a lot of people realize. And then as far as other features on the lens, you obviously have the ability to zoom it in and out. You have the control ring, which is a new thing that Canon has implemented on RF lenses that you can basically program to, adjust whatever setting you want. You have that out at the end of the lens, and then you obviously have the manual focusing ring on the lens as well. So pretty simple as far as settings and features on the lens there. And the main takeaway was that with 5.5 stops of image stabilization, this lens is, again, very impressive for its price. So now we'll move into the last big part of this lens that I want to focus on, and this is where things kind of begin to go downhill for this lens. So far, we've talked about sharpness, which is phenomenal for the price, focusing speed, which is phenomenal for the price, stabilization, which is phenomenal for the price. But then you get into aperture. And this is where, this lens starts to lack for wildlife photography. With this lens, you're going to be shooting at apertures between f5.6 and f8. Obviously, when you're shooting all the way out at 400, which I feel like with wildlife, a lot of times you're going to be doing, you're shooting at f8. And this is not by any means an ideal aperture. And that's really for a couple of reasons. For one, you want to let in as much light as possible into the lens so that you can lower your ISO. Obviously, when you're shooting at, f8 versus like f4, you're letting in a lot less light. At f4, you're going to be able to let in a lot more through aperture, and you're going to be able to bring down your ISO, increase your shutter speed, and produce cleaner images overall. And then on top of that, obviously, you're dealing with less bokeh and less background blur when you're shooting at f8, and you don't get that nice separation between your subject and the background like you would if you were shooting at f4 or f5.6 at 400 millimeters. So this is where this lens really begins to slip for me, and where the fact that it only costs $650 begins to make more sense, because this really just isn't an ideal aperture range for wildlife. I mean, not that you can't get some good photos in this range. I often shoot at this range when I'm using a teleconverter, when I'm shooting, like grizzly bears out in Wyoming, and I'm using my 100 to 400. A lot of times I'm also using a teleconverter on there to get 560. And when I do that on my EF 100 to 400, I'm shooting at f8. So the point is, you can get good images at f8, but you're definitely going to struggle to see, that amount of background blur that you really want to see in your images. And to kind of display this, I do have an example image here. You can see I took this the other day of a squirrel at 400 millimeters f8, and for this image I got pretty close to the squirrel here. And for those of you that don't know, when you get close to a subject using a telephoto lens, it introduces more background blur. So you already get background blur when you're shooting with a telephoto lens because of the compression that you get, and then obviously the more wide open your aperture can get, it introduces even more blur. But when you get close up to a subject, it also introduces blur. So you can see when I got up close to the squirrel and I was shooting it at f8 at 400 millimeters, I did get some background blur, but definitely not the amount that you want to see in an image like this. Typically, you would want this branch back here to be totally blown out and, just sink in and blur in with that background, and have a nice clean green and brown pastel background back here behind this squirrel in the tree and put the focus entirely on him. But you just don't get that at f8. Even though I was close to the subject, which typically would introduce more background blur, and I was shooting at 400, which introduces more compression and blurs that background even more. Because I was at f8, it introduced just too much focus back here, and kept these branches in the image back here, and didn't blur out any of these leaves and the greenery back here enough. It just didn't create the background blur that you want to see in your wildlife images, and didn't eliminate the background distractions as much as you would want it to, which is just something that's going to come with this lens and the price point that you're paying. You just don't get the same amount of blur that you would want, and that's just, you know, part of it, shooting at f8, something you got to deal with. And you'll also notice that this lens isn't really ideal in low light because of that, because it's shooting at f8 and you're not letting a lot of light in through your aperture. You have to increase the ISO and decrease your shutter speed, and obviously that leads to more blurry shots. So it's not an ideal low light lens either, which isn't very good for wildlife either, because you want to be able to shoot when wildlife is active, which is typically in low light conditions. So overall, the main takeaway here is that when it comes to aperture on this lens, you begin to see the lens lack a little bit. It's still a good lens for the price, but you're not getting the aperture that you want for wildlife photography. And that's mainly where this lacks, and where the fact that it costs, you know, less than $1,000 begins to make more sense. So in conclusion, I can say that I was pretty darn impressed with this lens in the time that I got to spend using it. Like I said, sharpness, phenomenal. Focusing speed, phenomenal. Stabilization, phenomenal. All of those held up to Canon's L series lenses, even though this isn't an L series lens. They held up in those fields. I mean, it was very impressive. I was definitely blown away and surprised by that. The only area where this lens begins to lack a little bit is in the aperture. You're not getting the aperture that is ideal for wildlife photography, but that's kind of what you get when you're paying so much less for the lens. So it's really a trade-off. You're saving a lot of money, but you're not going to get as low of an aperture as you're going to get if you go ahead and upgrade to like the RF 100-500 lens. That shouldn't deter anyone from using this lens or buying this lens. I still think it's a great lens, and I think really the application for this lens is for beginners in wildlife photography, looking for a budget lens that isn't going to break the bank, but isn't going to be, you know, a cheapo piece of equipment either. You're getting a lens that is tack sharp, a lens that has very fast autofocus, and that is overall a pretty solid lens, besides the fact that you just can't get the aperture that you want for wildlife. In all other fields, you're going to be satisfied. I think you're going to get sharp images that you like and that you'd be happy to hang on your wall. You're just not going to get as much background blur as you want in most wildlife images. And for a beginner, that's going to be okay. What you're doing with this lens is getting into the world of wildlife photography, and so using a lens like this that can still produce sharp results, that can still focus fast, is going to be great for you, and it's going to be a good purchase that, again, isn't going to break the bank and is going to allow you to get into this field of wildlife photography relatively cheap. So I think that's really the main application for this lens. And with that, I think that's really all that I have for this review, guys. I hope that you guys have found this helpful, and that, you know, you were able to get the information that you're looking for on this lens, and that I was able to explain all aspects of this lens clearly to you guys, and that you're able to, you know, get good examples and a good understanding of how this lens performs through this review. And I hope that you have enjoyed this video, and I want to thank you guys so much for watching. If you have stuck around to this point, if you haven't already, please do not forget to drop a like down below and comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if this is a lens that you're thinking about picking up. And most importantly, as always, subscribe to be entered for the 1,000 subscriber Manatee Swim giveaway video. And check out my Instagram and my Facebook page and my website, which will all be linked down below. I'm very active over on Instagram, posting all of my photos that I take over there and on Instagram stories, so you can check that out. I'm definitely much more active on there than I am on YouTube or any other platform. And I think that's all, like I said, guys. So thank you again for watching. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video, and I will see you all in the next one.